So you all know that story quite well, don't you? You learned it in Sunday school. The rich man and Lazarus. Well, there was once a Sunday school teacher who told his class about this story of the rich man and Lazarus, and he highlighted the very good end of Lazarus and the very bad end of the rich man. And then he highlighted how the one man went to hell and the other one got to go to heaven. And then he also pointed out how the one man was really rich and the other guy was really poor. After the teacher had taught this lesson, then he said to the class, "Now, which one would you rather be, the rich man or Lazarus?" One little boy sheepishly raised his hand and said, "Well, I'd like to be the rich man while I'm alive and Lazarus when I'm dead." And all God's people said, "You're there, aren't you?" We'd all like to be the rich man while we're alive and Lazarus when we're dead. Truth be told, that's what we all want. The best life now, followed by an eternal home in heaven with God forever. What a deal. Our hopes and our dreams for ourselves and our kids and our grandkids is that we will live a life here that's blessed. Nothing wrong with that. Nothing at all. But the bottom line is that what we want is to be happy. We want to live a life without regrets. Would you agree with me? Yeah? That's where we're all at. Okay, so I want to talk to you today about living a life where we're happy. And the first thing I want to talk about is what it means to be happy. Now, I realize that being happy means different things to different people, so it's kind of hard for me to stand up here and say this or that is going to make you happy. No, it's actually very different for everybody, and that's why before we dig into the parable about this rich man and Lazarus, I want to take a quick look first at that reading from 1 Timothy. We don't often read two lessons, do we? So let's go to 1 Timothy first. The very opening line of this reading says, "Of course, there is great gain in godliness, combined with contentment." Combined with contentment. So let me suggest right here and right now that maybe, just maybe, what you and I are actually looking for isn't happiness at all. And you're going, "Wait a minute, Nancy. What do you mean? I don't want to be happy?" Right. Of course I want to be happy. Doesn't everybody want to be happy? Yeah, you do. Well, let me suggest to you that what I think you really want is that life of contentment that 1 Timothy talks about. A life of contentment. Is that a better description of what you're looking for? Think about it. Paul is writing here to his young protege, a guy named Timothy, and he doesn't say a word about wanting Timothy to be happy. The word he uses is contentment. There's great gain in godliness combined with contentment. What's he up to here? Well, the word happiness is actually an emotion. Happiness depends on things happening to us. Hence the similarity between the two words. Happiness, happening. They're from the same source. So if we want to be happy, happy things have to happen to us. So in other words, I need a lot of good things happening at the right time and in the right way for me to be happy. But contentment is simply a way of being. It's a way of being satisfied. You see the difference? Happiness depends on something happening to me. Contentment is simply who I am. It's a way of being satisfied. Now, one resource that I read this week told me that the Greek word for contentment actually carries with it the notion of sufficiency. And the word I'm about to use is not a real word, but you'll get what I mean. Sufficiency and enoughness. Okay? Not a real word. Sufficiency and enoughness is what contentment is. Now, I know that's not a word that really exists in the world, but enoughness, it implies that satisfaction. In other words, people can be happy, but what they should really be pursuing is contentment. A number of years ago, we had an elderly member of our congregation that was hospitalized, and although she did recover from that hospitalization, she didn't think she was going to. And when I went to visit her in the ICU with several of her family members there, she started talking to me and kind of ignoring everybody else in the room. And she could barely speak. It was kind of a whisper. But I was standing right next to her. And she took my hand and she looked me square in the eye and she said, "Pastor, I just want you to know that my favorite sermon of yours was the one you preached about stuff." You remember that sermon, guys? I probably preached more than one. And it probably sticks with people because we all understand how tied to stuff we are. In fact, Ted and Debbie, I think it's your father-in-law, who every time tells me, "I'm going to clean out my attic." People tend to remember these sermons about stuff. And we all chuckled in that ICU room a little bit because we all remembered that sermon, perhaps because it applied to each and every one of us then and now. In fact, I preached one of those just a few weeks ago, if I recall. You remember the story about the other rich man who had a huge harvest and all he did was build more barns? What am I going to do? And what he does is builds more barns. Keep all of his stuff in the barns. But this elderly woman who was expecting to die, actually wanting to die, from her ICU bed preached to me. "Remember your sermon on stuff, Pastor? Life is not about stuff or having more stuff, especially when you reach the end of your life and you look back. It seems to me that life is not at all about acquiring wealth. It's not about hoarding money or having the things that money can buy, because those things, all that stuff, eventually owns you. Life is more about contentment, being satisfied, happy, because you're content. A satisfaction that actually leads to that kind of contentment. Now, you ask most people what would make them happy. Now, this is unscientific, but I'm going to ask you, and I bet I know how you're going to answer. What do you think would make you happy? Probably in the back of your head, you're saying winning the lottery, having more money. Now, there's nothing wrong with money. Don't get me wrong here. There is absolutely nothing wrong with money. It's a tool, but that's all it is. You need money. I need money. We all need money, and we need to use it as a tool in order to buy the things we need. Food, shelter. It's a tool that God gives us in order to provide for us. It's a tool with which I can pay my taxes, my mortgage, my heat bills, make contributions to the church, buy groceries at the grocery store. I need money because that's the way I can take care of my needs. But the other thing I can do with my money is share it with others. Now, on the other hand, both of our texts today have all sorts of warnings in them, don't they? They warn of danger, of loving money. That reading from 1 Timothy, the love of money is the root of all evil. Now, please notice that it doesn't say that money is the root of all evil. It's the love of money. That's the problem. The love of money. And I would guess that if I were to ask you today, right here, right now, what you would rather have, contentment or a lot of money? Okay, wait a minute. You can't answer both. Okay? You cannot tell me you want contentment and a lot of money. For the sake of today's question, you have to answer one or the other. Which would you prefer to have? Maybe a better way to phrase the question is, what would you rather pursue? Contentment or money? Now, one of my roles as pastor is to be an encourager. And so today I'm going to be very blunt. I would strongly encourage you to pursue contentment. Choose to be content in your life. Choose sufficiency. Choose to be satisfied. Choose enoughness. As I was doing some work for this sermon this week, I came across an article on MSN.com, and it was entitled The 25 Happiest, Healthiest Cities in America. And you'll never guess what number 6 was. Not Buffalo. Fargo, North Dakota. Who would have guessed? The 6th happiest, healthiest city in the country is Fargo, North Dakota. And whereas in the survey most other cities made the list because they had comments like, the folks ate healthy, they worked out. Do you know why Fargo made the list? I'm going to give you a hint. There are a lot of Lutherans in Fargo. Actually, there's a lot of Lutherans in North Dakota. But Fargo was identified very high on the happiness scale due to very high scores of regular church attendance. Now, no other city on the survey had that. But Fargo's fans say that the city's strong sense of community, which shows up then in those high scores of happiness, has something to do with attending religious services. I guess that makes up for the cold winters. I don't know. Here's a quote from the Lutheran pastor in town by the name of Stephanie Tollefson. She says, it's also a big clue to the town's warmth. Now, Stephanie is the pastor of Hope Lutheran Church, and they worship 5,000 people on a weekend. I told you there were a lot of Lutherans in Fargo, and a lot of Lutheran churches, too, so this isn't the only one. Can you imagine having 5,000 people in worship on a weekend? How cool would that be? But despite its size, she says, people here say that a generous heart is a happy heart. And I see that. The more you connect with other people, the more joy you get back. And the more joy you have, the more you want to give back. It becomes the circle. In Fargo, she says, people genuinely seem to want to belong to something that's bigger than just themselves. You see, it really does boil down to our attitude. For instance, going back to the gospel reading today of the rich man and Lazarus, notice that the rich man is not condemned for being rich. That's not the problem. And I want to be absolutely clear here. He's not condemned for being rich. But it seems to me that the rich man in this parable lost sight of what it does mean to love God and love his neighbor. Specifically, in this case, the poor man named Lazarus, who sat right at his gate. Every time the rich man came and went, there sat Lazarus. This isn't some guy that he can pass by going around the block. He's sitting at the guy's gate. And every time he left his home, there sat Lazarus. And his problem is that he neglected Lazarus. I shared with you a few weeks ago that parable of the rich fool, the parable where he built those barns. And it seems that the rich man in that parable didn't quite know what to do with all of his possessions. He kept keeping them. The problem was that he lived as if God didn't exist. And that's the same thing that happened in our parable today. The rich man lived as if God didn't exist. As any of the commands of God didn't matter in his life. He didn't care about the poor, the hungry, the thirsty. It mattered not. He walked right by Lazarus day in and day out. So, what can we learn from this parable today? May I suggest to you that the life that really is a life worth living is not found in accumulating wealth, just for the sake of accumulating wealth. And what any of us do with our money, what any of us do with the wealth that's ours, is actually our choice. Remember, wealth isn't the problem. It's the choices we make about wealth that is. The rich man in the parable that Jesus told apparently didn't choose very well. And although you and I don't live in Fargo, North Dakota, I sense that here in this place at Crossroads Lutheran Church in Amherst, where we don't worship 5,000, but still I sense that there is joy and contentment among us. And if that's true, then I believe that that joy and contentment is what's guided you to your generous hearts. The good news for us today is that there was a time, spiritually, when each of us were the Lazaruses of the world. Each of us, maybe not poor with sores on our bodies, but each of us were beggars, lying at a gate, totally helpless. And guess who came to help us? Jesus Christ. He noticed us, and he loved us just the way we were. And as we remember that truth, that compassion, that grace, Christ calls us then to look around and see someone who needs our attention, our compassion, and our love. So let me ask you a question. Are there people in your world, needy, hurting people, who need your attention? Maybe they're within your own families or next door. Maybe it's a student at school. Maybe it's a colleague at work. Maybe it's a homeless person on the streets of Buffalo that you pass on a regular basis. Or a child who goes to school hungry. Or maybe it's a family in Africa who could avoid the deadly disease of malaria if they just had a mosquito net. These are the Lazaruses that lie at our gates that we cannot avoid. We see them day in and day out. The bottom line is, if you really want contentment, if you are really looking for joy in your life, I guarantee you that living your life in such a way that God is glorified and for the benefit of others, that's the real secret to a successful, joy-filled life of contentment. It's not about keeping it for me. It's not about how much wealth I can accumulate. It's about how much can I help others. And in fact, I would be so bold today as to suggest to you that God's greatest desire for us is that we actually live a life of contentment, not a life of happiness, a life of satisfaction, of enoughness. And by the way, if we live that life of contentment, we're likely to be very happy when we learn that secret.